Hey guys, it's Alex, and just to let you know, the kind people at the r/vegan subreddit reached out to me, and I'll be doing an Ask Me Anything there for about 2 hours on the 8th of July. The link is in the description if you have any burning questions. While I'm at it, it turns out too that I have a subreddit as well, r/cosmic skeptic. I don't run it, but I think it would be cool to maybe go over some of the submissions in future videos and review its content and things like that. So go and check it out and subscribe over there, and thanks to the people who set that up. Also, in order to make more animal rights related content and to reach a younger audience, I opened, don't judge me, a TikTok account. You can find me at Ask a Vegan, where I respond to comments and make short 1-minute videos about veganism. Also, only about 10% of my subscribers here follow me on Twitter, and Twitter is where it's at right now, so give me a follow there too if you're into sarcastic witticisms, I guess. Anyway, today, you read the title right, I'm going to try to debunk myself. More specifically, I'm going to debunk one of my own videos that I made about 3 years ago, since, frankly, my opinions have changed, and I think it's important to record my philosophical shifts, especially because the old video is still available to watch. I asked my patrons to vote on which video they wanted to see next, and they seemed excited at the prospect of me documenting how my feelings have changed. The video I'm going to respond to today, then, is a video I made years ago, supposedly debunking the Kalam cosmological argument. A shout out to my patrons, by the way, for allowing me to afford a haircut when the lockdown is finally over. Recently on my channel, as you'll know, I spoke to William Lane Craig, the man who gave the Kalam cosmological argument its name. We had a really fantastic discussion, link is in the description of course, on some in-depth implications of that particular argument. And at some point during my reflections on our conversation, I watched that video back, that video that I made all those years ago on the Kalam, and I just really don't think it was very good. I mean, perhaps it was good for an 18-year-old who hadn't formally studied philosophy yet and hadn't spoken to the man who coined the argument, which, by the way, it doesn't escape me how lucky I am to have had that opportunity. But after having given the argument some serious study, especially in preparation to talk to Dr. Craig, I realised that some of the things I previously said were not particularly well thought out, to say the least. Now, to be sure, I still don't quite buy the Kalam cosmological argument, for reasons expressed in my conversation with Dr. Craig, but those reasons are now quite different from the reasons I gave in this old video of mine, so let's play it, let's watch it, and I'll try to pick up on where I think I went wrong. I do have various responses to some of the points that I'll raise here, but this video is solely focused on putting counter-arguments to what I said 3 years ago, and pointing out what I didn't get properly right. So the video begins with me giving a fairly inaccurate account of Aquinas' cosmological arguments. I then note that if we say something like, everything needs a cause, and so God must exist, we can also ask, well, what caused God? So to avoid that question, we get the Kalam cosmological argument. Well, this is where the Kalam cosmological argument comes in. It makes one small adjustment to the original premises. Instead of saying that everything has a cause, it says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And God has always existed, he never began, and therefore is exempt from this infinite regress. And hey presto, problem solved, right? Well, no, and let me tell you why. Okay, so to be clear, this is the Kalam cosmological argument. Premise 1, everything which begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, as I say in the video, I'm about to try to list some reasons why this argument doesn't allow us to prove God's existence. So let's go through them. Firstly, you may have noticed that I referred to this first mover just then as God, as he. But there's a world of difference between proving the existence of some kind of arbitrary first mover and proving the existence of a god, and especially your particular god. Even if the Kalam cosmological argument was sound, which I hope to prove to you that it's not, it still wouldn't prove any particular god. Okay, now this is only half true, but my biggest mistake here, quite simply, was expecting more of the Kalam than I should have. The Kalam cosmological argument never claimed to prove the existence of, say, the Christian god. I mean, of course it doesn't. Kalam is an Arabic word referring to Islamic theology. If Dr. Craig had ever claimed that the Kalam proved the existence of the Christian God specifically, it'd be seriously strange for him to name it in homage to Muslim philosophers like Al-Kindi and Al-Ghazali, who Dr. Craig explicitly cites as influences on his version of the argument. It's unlikely that these Muslim influences would inspire an argument that claims to prove the Christian God specifically. The Kalam cosmological argument seeks to prove that there is something outside of the universe that brought the universe into existence. That's it. Right? It doesn't attempt to prove, say, that Jesus died for our sins, or that God doesn't want men to get it on with other men, or that the Ten Commandments are true, or anything like that. So it was wholly unfair of me to criticize it for not doing so, for not trying to prove a particular God. It'd be like me putting forward an argument, say, that an alien civilization must exist based on probability of life in the universe or something. And someone turned around and said, well, even if your argument is true, it can't tell us who the president of that civilization is. Well, who cares? I never claimed that it did. Sure, the Kalam might not tell us whether the creator of the universe is the Christian God, but the Kalam never claimed that it could do, so that's not a problem. But even so, the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't necessarily just get us to what I called in my old video, quote, some kind of arbitrary first mover. But there's a world of difference between proving the existence of some kind of arbitrary first mover and proving the existence of a god. I said this to imply that even if the Kalam is correct, all you have is the existence of some nondescript cause, and no reason to assign it any properties, like omnipotence, omniscience, eternality, etc. But I completely fail to consider something crucial. When the Kalam speaks of the universe, it doesn't just mean the observable universe, or our universe. It means every material thing that exists. In a moment, I try to debunk the idea that the universe began to exist by saying that the Big Bang wasn't necessarily the beginning of everything, just our universe. But that just means I didn't properly understand the terminology, since if anything materially existed before or outside of the Big Bang, it would be included in what the Kalam is calling the universe. We'll get into that properly in a moment, but the relevant point here is that this means that if the Kalam is accurate and the universe does have a cause, then what I claimed in my video isn't true. There actually are things that we can at least arguably know about the nature of the cause and properties that we can assign to it. For example, if, by definition, anything that materially exists is part of the universe, then whatever caused the universe must be immaterial, since if it was material, it would just be part of the universe, not its cause. So immediately we can say that the cause must be immaterial. Right? If time is a property of the universe, then whatever caused it must exist outside of time, or timelessly. We can make arguments like these to say that if the universe did have a cause, we actually can argue more than just, as I originally said, that it's some kind of arbitrary first mover. That is to say, there actually are at least some properties of this cause that we can at least arguably assign to it if it does exist. It still doesn't get us to the Christian God, of course, but it does get us to something that looks a lot more like some form of God than just some random nondescript object. We might also say something like, for instance, if the universe has a cause, that cause must at least have some form of creative power too, since if something caused the universe, it must have the power and the creative capacity to do so. Now, don't misunderstand me, you can of course argue against all of these points I'm raising. You could argue, for instance, that the universe somehow caused itself, or was caused by something within itself, and so the cause of the universe actually isn't immaterial, or something like that, so we can't assign that particular property to the cause. But two things. First, I didn't even consider arguments of this kind in my original video, except for one that we'll speak about in a moment, but I didn't even really consider these arguments, despite asserting that their conclusion is false, right? I said, if the universe has a cause, we have no reason to assign any properties to that cause. But I simultaneously failed to mention any of the arguments in favour of doing exactly that. Of course it's easy for me to say that we can't conclude something when I omit any mention of the arguments in its favour. Nice going, teenage Alex. But secondly, and more interestingly, notice that if we do counter the assignment of a property like immateriality to the cause of the universe with a claim like the universe caused itself, or the universe was caused by something within the universe, as far as philosophical claims go, these are quite sketchy ones, right? Saying the universe was maybe caused by something material, so it was caused to exist by something within itself, even though that thing wouldn't exist before the universe in order to bring it into existence. Yikes, it's a bit messy and not a particularly compelling position to hold. But of course, so far in my original video, I was granting that the Kalam cosmological argument was sound, right? All of this so far relies on the idea that it is sound, that there is a beginning to the universe and that it does have a cause, right? But I said in my original video that even if it does have a cause, even if the argument is sound, we don't know anything about the nature of this cause. I now think that this is, at the very least, far from certain. There are some really compelling arguments to say that if there is a cause to the universe, it must have at least some godlike properties, like immateriality. At worst, the only way I can escape attributing certain godlike properties to this cause would be to adopt some strange and unprovable claims, like that the universe somehow caused itself. In doing so, I'd be adopting a burden of proof of my own for that claim, and no longer able to say something like, I'm just unconvinced. At the very least, my position was far more controversial and in need of defense than I realized when I first claimed that the cause of the universe could be completely nondescript. What I said still could be correct. It's just not as simple as I thought it was back then. And notice that those godlike properties that we do have some good reason to ascribe to a cause of the universe, like timelessness, immateriality, creative power, these things are claimed by Dr. Craig to be derived from the Kalam cosmological argument. And those godlike properties that we can't derive from the Kalam, like Jesus being the Son of God, well, those were never claimed to be proven by the Kalam. Right? Of course, if we judge the Kalam against our own standard of wanting to prove that the Christian God exists, we'll find it to be an awful argument easily. But if we consider it against the standard that it actually claims to meet, it's just a little bit more attractive. Just a little bit. Still, I did actually respond in the original video to one property that the Kalam tries to ascribe to the cause of the universe, and that property is personality. Now, weirdly, I used an example from Frank Turek, an apologist, instead of William Lane Craig, the go-to Kalam philosopher. I can't remember why this is. Maybe it was just the first clip I could find, but maybe it was because I thought that Turek's case was easier to defeat. I really wasn't steel-manning the argument. But still, I didn't even do a very good job of responding even to him. Let's take a look. Now, Frank Turek, who we've encountered before on this channel, has had this contention put to him on more than one occasion, and he attempts to get around it by claiming that whatever it was that caused the universe had to be some kind of personal being, because it had to make a choice in creating the universe. Here's a clip from one of his videos called From the Kalam to the Biblical God.
And then also personal. Why does the being need to be personal? Because in order to make a choice, which is what you have to do in order to go from a state of nothingness to a state of creation, you have to be a person.
But Turek and others like him fail to consider the fact that consciousness is not always needed as a driving force behind something happening. I mean, does a leaf choose to fall off of a tree? Oh boy. Okay, so this is an obvious straw man on my part. Well, not technically, I guess, because I didn't do it on purpose. But clearly, no serious philosopher thinks that consciousness is always needed for anything to happen. I really wasn't being very careful with my words there. Consciousness is not always needed as a driving force behind something happening. And look, there's a lesson in this about always reading the right material, right? If I had read a better defense of the argument that Turek is hitting on here, I wouldn't have made this ridiculous mistake, because it's actually quite a compelling argument, right? But I just hadn't done such reading. Luckily, I have now, so let me try to explain this argument to you now that I actually somewhat understand what it says. So first, remember, I wasn't yet criticizing the Kalam itself, but just the conclusion. I said that even if the Kalam was sound, we can't ascribe the property of personality to the cause of the universe. That is, I was just granting that the premises are true. So granting that the Kalam is sound and valid, that the universe did have a beginning and the universe does have a cause, think about this. Proponents of the Kalam think that the cause of the universe would be timeless, infinite, since it exists outside of time. And we're also granting that the effect, the universe, is finite, since we're granting that it had a beginning at some point. So here's the kicker, the really interesting consideration. How can a finite effect come from an infinite cause? Right? If the universe began to exist, it's finite. If whatever caused it to exist is infinite, then we have something really weird going on. Right? If the cause never changed its nature, never did anything, never made a choice, to use Turek's words, then why was this cause at one point insufficient to bring the universe into existence, and at another point sufficient such that it did bring the universe into existence? I mean, if there is a cause of the universe, then that cause must have sufficient properties to bring the universe into existence, right? Otherwise it couldn't be its cause. But if the cause doesn't change, doesn't make choices, isn't personal, then because it never changes, it must always have sufficient properties to bring the universe into existence. But if the cause is infinite, and always was sufficient to bring the universe into existence, the universe should be infinite too, since as long as the cause existed, it was such that it was sufficient to bring the universe into existence, and so the effect should be equally long-lasting. It should be infinite as well. If, however, the cause is infinite, but the effect is only finite, which is precisely what the Kalam argues, something must have happened. Right, something about the cause must have changed to bring it from a state of insufficiency, where it didn't bring the universe into existence, into a state of sufficiency, such that it did bring the universe into existence. Without such a change, you can't have a finite effect from an infinite cause. So it seems that if the universe has a cause, and the universe is finite, that cause can't just be some kind of idle object. Some, again, to use my words, some kind of arbitrary first mover. Instead, it must, well, do something to bring the universe into existence. It must change in some way, and that change can't be caused by something external to it, since nothing is external to it before the universe begins. Right? The cause is the cause of everything that materially exists. So before the universe exists, there can't be anything materially existing outside of the cause to change its nature. Whatever did change its nature from insufficiency to sufficiency has to come from within itself. That sounds a lot like the cause making a choice of its own accord. But okay, you might say something like, well, what if the change in sufficiency of the cause came from something external to it, but that external thing was just another non-material object, right? Another non-material cause. Well, here's the problem with that. If the change in the nature of an immaterial cause is due to some other immaterial cause, you have to explain the change in that cause's sufficiency too. And if you just posit another external cause, you have to explain the change in that cause's nature as well. And you end up with either an infinite regress of an infinite number of non-material causes, or you arrive at some non-material cause that ceases the regress by changing its own nature, seemingly making a choice in at least some vague sense. Now, of course, you could just quite simply say that there is some kind of infinite regress of immaterial causes existing outside of the universe. But, well, is that really plausible? Well, I discussed the plausibility of infinite regresses with Dr. Craig in our podcast, but just bear in mind that if we don't accept that infinite regresses are possible, as many philosophers do not, then we have a pretty interesting argument here to say that whatever caused the universe must have made a choice in at least some vague sense, as I say. It must have somehow changed its own nature. Right? Clearly, there are a great many discussions to be had on this question, but I hope you can see that my simple dismissal of it in my original video was a bit ridiculous. I still can't believe I just talked about a leaf falling off a tree, as if that in any way addressed the very serious philosophical challenge. This should be a lesson in always reading the strongest and clearest version of any argument that you wish to try and rebut. Right, okay, cleared that up. But as I said before, this whole question of attributing godlike qualities to the cause of the universe relies on the idea that there is a cause of the universe, right? It was a big mistake on my part to overlook these points that we just discussed. But we've only thus far discussed my criticism of the conclusion, not my criticism of the soundness of the argument itself, right? It wasn't a criticism of either of the premises. So now, to save time, let me just briefly touch on my biggest mistake when discussing the concept of infinite regresses and the universe beginning to exist. And look, this whole argument exists for the sake of it being impossible for there to be an infinite regress of causation. But is that really an impossibility? I mean, to be sure, our observable universe did have a beginning. The Big Bang did happen. I mean, you can actually see it with the right kind of telescope. In fact, if you want to see a video on some proofs for the Big Bang, do let me know in the comments. It's been something that I've been considering doing for a while, so if you want to see that, do let me know. Now, theists often point to the Big Bang and say, well look, here's the beginning of everything in existence. There must have been some kind of cause behind it. But hold on, because the Big Bang has never claimed to be the beginning of everything. Rather, it's only ever claimed to be the beginning of everything that we know of. Perhaps there were universes before ours. Perhaps the death of one universe is the Big Bang of the next, and this could be some kind of infinite chain. Perhaps there's a multiverse, and not even a multiverse of separate entities, but maybe one large, infinitely large fabric in which there are sort of localized areas of activity, one of which is our observable universe, which did have its own beginning. There's simply no way for us to know. Aquinas, Craig, and Turek alike assume some kind of singular grand beginning to not only our universe, but anything that does, will, and can exist. And there's simply no proof to back this up. Yeah, and Dr. Craig doesn't claim that there is such proof. Right, again, I'm just completely misunderstanding what his argument actually is. Right, in my original video here, my argument appears to be something like, people like Dr. Craig say the universe had a grand beginning, but we can't know that the Big Bang was actually the beginning of everything. Right, But as I said before, I was mistaking the definition of universe in the Kalam cosmological argument. If there was a universe before ours, or a multiverse, or whatever, then these things being material objects, they would just be incorporated into the universe with a capital U, the universe as defined by William Lane Craig. That is, if a universe existed before the Big Bang simply wasn't the beginning of the universe in the sense that we're talking about. But more troublingly, I implied that William Lane Craig doesn't think that infinite regresses are possible because of the Big Bang. But this is flatly false. As he told me himself, the reason Dr. Craig doesn't think that infinite regresses are possible, that is, that the universe must be finite, has nothing to do with empirical evidence for the beginning of the universe and the Big Bang, and everything to do with just rational philosophy. Right, here he is in his own words.
Historically, the second premise that the universe began to exist was supported by philosophical arguments. It wasn't until the 20th century that there was any sort of empirical evidence for the beginning of the universe. And as I looked at the various arguments that were offered historically for the beginning of the universe, the finitude of the past, it seemed to me that two of them stood out. One would be the argument based on the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things in reality. And then the other would be the impossibility of forming an actually infinite collection of things by successive addition. These arguments are independent of each other. Even if one fails, the other could still be sound. And so together, I think they provide very persuasive philosophical grounds for affirming the finitude of the past and hence the beginning of the universe.
Notice how Dr. Craig doesn't reference the Big Bang at all. His argument that there can't be an infinite past, that is, that the universe, including all universes, began to exist, is not based in scientific data, but principally on two philosophical arguments, dating from long before the science of cosmology even existed. So to clarify, in my old video, I said, the Kalam depends on the idea that there can't be an infinite regress, right? But the Big Bang never claimed to be the beginning of everything, and so might not be the end of that regress. Right, now, I was correct that Dr. Craig believes the universe is finite, but I completely misunderstood why he thought this. It's not got anything to do with the Big Bang, and everything to do with arguments that an actually infinite number of things, such as a number of past events in the universe, metaphysically can't exist. And if you want to know what those philosophical arguments are, and hear us discuss them, then you can watch our discussion in full. But just note that those arguments are not empirical, they're not scientific, they're not about the Big Bang. So when I kind of claimed that Dr. Craig doesn't have any evidence that the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, well, okay, but he never claimed that it was. There's a lot that we don't know about the laws of physics. There's probably a lot that we can't know about the laws of physics. I mean, let's not forget that we are constrained to one single universe. There's no way for us to compare it with any others. We can test things within the universe because we can make control variables when we have more than one example of the thing that we're trying to test. Right, which is precisely why someone needs to use philosophical arguments rather than scientific evidence if they want to claim that absolutely everything began to exist. You know, like William Lane Craig did and does. Again, I'm criticizing proponents of the Kalam for something that a lot of the time they just don't do. Now, I know that sometimes they do. I know that Frank Turek has used the Big Bang to argue that the universe began to exist. But I was giving off the impression that the Big Bang is the only reason for us to believe that the universe can't be infinite. I, again, wasn't tackling the strongest version of the argument, which in my view now is that philosophical argumentation that Craig prefers to use. Again, nothing to do with the Big Bang or even science generally. Now, I can say in all honesty that the reason I didn't consider what I now think are the strongest arguments for the finitude of the universe is because I just wasn't really aware of them, right? But I think it was irresponsible of me to not do the proper research in that regard and make a video as if it was comprehensive and exhaustive when it simply wasn't. And just so you know, the worst part, in my view, about that old video of mine, and the real reason that I wanted to make this response, isn't necessarily because I got anything wrong, per se. I mean, what I said might still be correct, but I just wasn't engaging with the argument in full. I hadn't done the proper reading, I wasn't tackling the proper arguments or the hardest arguments, and so I just think it was giving off the wrong impression and an irresponsible philosophical video, especially because I paraded it as though it was some kind of grand debunking of the argument, when it didn't even really scratch the surface. So in summary, I hope that you can now see that basically, while I didn't necessarily get anything wrong in my original video, I didn't say anything incorrect, I was just arguing against positions either that people don't actually hold or that are the weakest versions of the arguments available. Right? I said that the Kalam doesn't get us to a particular God, even though nobody claimed that it did. I argued that conscious choice isn't always needed for actions to occur, even though nobody claimed that it is. I argued that the Big Bang doesn't necessarily give us reason to think that the universe is finite, even though Dr. Craig never claimed that it did. And what I didn't mention was the myriad of far more challenging philosophical arguments for the finitude of the universe that I could have found with a bit of searching and a bit of reading. Again, I finally did discuss those arguments with Dr. Craig himself, so do check out our full conversation. But the ultimate takeaway is that clearly I just wasn't listening hard enough. I wasn't reading the arguments properly. I wasn't doing the proper research. And above all, this should serve as a reminder that whenever you watch a video, including one of mine, never take the speaker's word for granted. Right? Never assume that they've done all the research and thinking necessary to fully address the argument they're discussing. Do your own reading, listen to the other side, be charitable in your interpretations. These things will lead to far more effective philosophy and far more effective thinking too. So thank you for watching. I just wanted to get off my chest that after talking to Dr. Craig and preparing for our conversation, I just realized that my past video was highly flawed. I don't consider it embarrassing to say that I was wrong on these points. I actually find it incredibly exciting because God knows what else I've gotten wrong in my 4 years on YouTube. Maybe I'll make more videos like this one if you enjoyed it. Do let me know in the comments if you did, and I'll revisit some more of my old videos. But in the meantime, thank you for watching, and a special thanks, as always, to my top-tier patrons who allow me to do what I do. If you do like my content, please do consider supporting me on Patreon via the link in the description. Follow me on social media as well, if you like. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.